Ooh, now we're live. This is a sort of continuation of the Valentine's thing, but I thought it'd be an interesting opportunity to go over essentially one of the biggest challenges that face meshers is making their UV maps usable, or making them essentially more, well, easier to use for drivers. So what I've got open is ShannonMac's Valentine's mesh showing the UV map that we unwrapped. Yes, user-friendly, that's the word I was looking for. Thank you, Hot Rod. So what we want to do as meshers is try and make our meshes as user-friendly as possible. Because obviously for derivers, where's the letter L? That's the letter L. So for derivers, although the mesher has essentially created a relatively straightforward and simple UV map, if the mesher wanted to place some text, come on text tool, wake up. I was just using this tool. There we go. So let's say, for the sake of argument, texture artist wanted to wrap that "love me now" exclamation mark several times. It's an urgent request if there ever was one. So if they wanted to wrap that text around the upright, this bit of the mesh, they would kind of struggle because they've got to essentially match, or they've got to determine which bit of this, where's my paint tool, which bit of these sections correspond to these uprights. And they would have to do a lot of trial and error to try and figure that out. So what meshers can do, what we can do as meshers, is we can't make it completely user-friendly because we are constrained by the amount of texture space that we have available and the way these shapes that we have unwrap relative to that space. But we can do things that, we can do things within the space that we do have that help, that would help the texture artist. So one of the things that you want to try and do is looking at Shannon's letter L, for instance. Let me just split this off so that it makes it easy to do. So we're just doing a control left click drag to do a loop select or lasso select, and in wireframe mode that basically means that it selects everything within the bounds of the selection loop. Then just press the P key and separate. So now that we've got the letter L isolated, so looking at the way that we unwrapped Shannon's mesh, we did it. We did a very basic unwrap. So essentially, what we've done is split the sides, or the front and this is actually the front and back of the letter from the sides, which loops right around the object. And of course this creates these sections that we have. But what we can do is to make this slightly more user-friendly. What we can do is look at the way that the object is constructed. And for the letter L, we have a couple of sections. We have this upper section, and you can see the corresponding UV sections on the left here. And then we have the lower section, which again has its corresponding UV components. So what we can do is break the object up so that these sections of UV are not necessarily joined together per se, but are as close or clear to the deriver, because essentially what we're trying to do is make it clear to the person deriving the texture where each of the sections are. So this section corresponds to the top, but we also want it to correspond to the top of the upright or the serif bit of the letter, so that if they wanted to wrap some text around the top, it would make it easy. It would be easier for them to do that. Same with the middle section, and this would be the easiest one to do. But of course you have to watch out for splitting the object up into too many small segments, which then creates its own problem, because you then essentially split the top and the bottom from the center section, which means that you are breaking the front and sides up. So this can be slightly tricky. So what we're going to do is play around just with this letter L. We're going to play around with this and see what sorts of layouts that we can create that may or may not be optimal for derivation. And of course this means that basically we're doing a lot of experimenting and testing to see which one works the best. So what I shall do is duplicate this. We'll use the same texture, but so that we have a comparison, we'll keep the original, Shift D, just duplicate, and move that to a new layer. So that's the M key, M for Marty. I'll just use these ones at the bottom. So that's now on its own. So duplicate that again, move that to another layer. So that's on its own. So we'll leave the original and we'll edit the UV maps for these duplicates. So first things first, clear all marked seams, mesh, edges, and clear seams. So we now have an unmarked mesh, no seams. So let's try let's try splitting so we want to wrap around the body of the letter, but we want to make sure that the top is split. So what we can do here then is we need to isolate the face, or the top serif section, and we need to isolate the bottom. So those are split at those edges, or will be split. And then we need to mark an edge across the upright, so that will split the top away from the sides. It's a shame I don't have screen annotation. Need to find some. Does anybody know any what's that plugin people use to create take snapshots of their screen? Does that have a annotation thingamajiggery tool? If anybody knows anyone, if anyone knows of software that does that, pop it in chat. You could do with one of those. Right, so yeah, so what that's done is, although the edges aren't marked yet, what we've basically done here is isolated the front and back and the sides of the upright. So if we mark seams for this, mesh, edges, mark seam, and then we will need to split the edge. Yeah, so is that the front or the back? Right, it's the back, so we need to place a seam there. Mark seam. So let's unwrap this. So select all. So watching, we've still got the original wireframe underneath. Light shot, is that what it's called? Oh, hang on. Oh, right. So, so Deb's just. Is there a program that allows you, not a screenshot, what ideally could do with, without loading up Zoom or anything like that, is something that will allow us to scribble all over the screen in the same way that, well, in a similar way to what we were just doing in, this is called Photo Paint, but, you know, in the same way that we can do this within an image editor, we need something that we can do this over the entire screen so that we can scribble on things to make it easier to highlight. You could do this with Zoom, but that means loading up Zoom, and you have to be in a chat to enable the tools, which is a bit well, it's not odd, but you have to be in a chat to enable the tools. But anyway, back to so we've got the edges marked. This is what we've got at the moment. So just with the mouse cursor over the UV image editor, press the E key, and that will unwrap the object. And what that's done, switch selection mode to island. That's this button down here. So what we've got is the sides the sides and, well, that's the front and back and sides as a single UV unit. And then we've got that's the top. So that's the top, and that will be the bottom. So what we could do with this is that if we were using this layout, so that's the bottom. So to make this easy for derivers, what you'd want to do is rotate, because we're trying to fit within the space that we've got. So you are essentially orientating the UV map so that it all sits along the same orientation. So if you were to, yes, so that makes it now easier to, so looking at that as a deriver, let me just move this into the grey area. Desktop. So as a deriver, we can see that this single face, UV face, is going to be associated with these two because it's the largest one. And we can also guesstimate that this one is associated with these two. So all we would need to figure out is which way round this section is. So if you typed love me now across this UV, all you would need to know now is which way. Is it flipped upside down to match this face, or is it flipped upside down to match this face? But this makes it easier for the deriver to see how everything fits together, because you've got clearly defined sections, UV sections. So that's the top, that's the entire body of the letter or the mesh, and that's the bottom. Of course, we've got a little bit of overlap, so you'd have to be mindful of that. Which, you know, for the sake of making it easy to derive from, you have to then ask yourself a question as to whether you leave that in and have the texture artist work around that, or the only other solution or option would be to, let's see which side that is. That's that front face. So what we would have to do, or what we would likely do, oh, that's why we're in edge select mode. What we would tend to have to do is just to isolate that and move it somewhere else, but relative to this main body that we've selected. But if you do that, you obviously then break the unity of this middle section, so the texture artist then has to crop their work at this point, crop their work here, and continue it here. So either or. So this is one of the things that you have to do as a mesher, is consider these issues, because obviously there's no easy way around complex shapes like this. Although this is actually a relatively simple shape, the fact that we've got this little overlap creates an additional problem. So that's one way of doing it, and you can see that we've actually used up about half the 512. Checking chat. I shall have to have a look at this, Liana MC. Thanks for that. I shall take a look at that. Yes, script. So basically, what we could do is, you can't Zoom, the program that we normally use when we're doing the streams with Shannon or Jinx, has the ability to draw on screen. But if you're not in a meeting, those tools aren't available. But they're incredibly useful for highlighting things that you are looking at or wanting to highlight, hence the word. But I don't know of any program that does that just for the sake of, you know, highlighting something on screen, unless you are in a meeting with somebody, aka Zoom, Skype, Join Me, GoToMeeting, all the other ones. Yes, I'll take a look at that, Liana. Yeah. Yeah, I'll take a look at that. So where were we? Yes, so reorganizing the UVs. So from just this simple adjustment, we've essentially used half the 512 that we had before. And it makes it slightly easier for the person deriving to then, derive the texture or derive the mesh. So how else could we derive this? So unwrap this. So that's one way. So let's switch to the other one. So the bottom of the letter isn't going to be seen much. So could we... Alright, so first things first, clear all the seams that were previously marked. Clear seams. So what would happen if we unwrap this so that it spreads based on the top face? So that's this top face. So we would need to, looking at it from the point of view of it being a box, so we create a split all the way around on both sides, but we leave the top edge whole or untouched. And then what we can do is possibly so what this should do is create a top section that unwraps itself flat, and then let's do something quite, so Let me think. So we need to clear that edge. Ooh, this could be tricky. Let's see what that does. So essentially what we've done is we've split the upright across the diagonal. So there's an edge marked on that side and an edge marked on the right. So what that does... Oh, I'm going to lose all my edge selections now. So what that does is associate this face on the left with this front face on the right, whereas on this side it associates this face with, I guess that's the back. Yeah, so that's the back of the mesh, and it splits along the bottom and along the top. So this should essentially get us or produce the L's flat, laid flat, with the top face being the connecting element. So we're going to mark all those edges. Mark seam, and then we're going to unwrap that. So mouse over the UV image editor and press the E key. And what has that done? So yes, that has done what it thought it was going to do. Right, so what we've created here let's turn these around so that we can increase their size a little bit and go. So what we've got here is the front, and we've still got that overlap. So there's the front face and the back, but we've continued that across the top, and then we've associated the one side with, I guess that's the front, is it? No, that's the back. So that's the back of the mesh, and then we've got this face associated with this side. And we can check which face that's on. Oh no, so that's the back. So that's the back. And that's the front. So this makes it slightly easier to do a different type of texturing. So you would be wrapping text, you know, "Love Me Now" would be wrapped around the top, and that would be relatively easy to do. Also, to a certain degree, wrapped around the torso, because we have two faces selected as part of the unwrap. So those two and those two. Just move that into the workspace to make it easier to see. So that's the unwrap for that. But again, the shape of the letter means that we've got this overlap. So what might have to be done here that's going to be tricky to solve, because you can't because that's obviously wrapping around. The next face that should be here is the front, and obviously that's attached to all of this, so we can't detach this section so that it attaches to this section without breaking the entire thing up. So an alternative, so let me just duplicate this so that we are using this same UV map that we've just created. Shift D, move this to another layer. So what we could do, so that's the, which side is that again? So what we could do then is let me think. Okay, so we could put a seam. Oh, that's a shortcut. Control E. Mark seam. What we could do is place a seam there. So what that does, it will split this selection that we've got. It'll split it from the top. And then, so that's that face. So we want to remove that seam. So what this should do is split the top. Yeah, so that'll split the top and then should rotate this and join it to this section. Well, yeah, Liana's just dropped to the grease pencil works to a degree, but it's not really what we need. What's needed? Need to be able to essentially mark over the top of well, it's not just Blender, it's whatever you're working on screen. So grease pencil would only work within Blender. Essentially what's needed is something that will allow you to mark the screen rather than the program. So let's unwrap that again, see what that does. Yeah, so that's created, and again we still have this issue with the overlap, and that's the problem that we've got with this particular letter. But we've got our two sections again, and we've got a degree of continuity, and as per before, we're not, well, based on the default scaling, we can scale this up to use more texture space. So compromise again. We are getting closer to unifying the object to make it easier to derive from. So with this, what we can next do to possibly even connect this bottom section to the main body that we've unwrapped is, so if I, so we'll duplicate this one, use what we've got as a basis, move this to another layer, and edit this. So what we can do here is remove one of the edges that are marked on the bottom of the mesh. So Control E, clear seam. Let's try unwrapping that, see what that does. So this is what we get from that. Whoops. So this makes it slightly more obvious where all the sections are. So we've essentially kept as much as possible joined together and basically splitting only the essential sections of the mesh. And that unifies the whole UV map into one big section. But again, we've still got this problem with the overlap. And that's not going to be an easy thing to solve within the context of trying to make this an easily derivable object. So it's a question of having to compromise, and that will be, or not necessarily making it clear to the deriver or the person deriving that this issue occurs, but that's something that you would have to be aware of. Otherwise, it essentially means that, so this is easy to derive from, easier, but you've got this overlap problem, whereas the original has no overlaps, but it's slightly more complicated to derive from because we don't know which section belongs to which section of the mesh. So these larger ones, those are the front, well, those are the sides of the upright. And you would have to do a bit of experimenting as a deriver to determine which way up they are. So we can make the UV maps super easy to just do simple derivations from, or we can make the derivation process slightly easier by joining everything up or keeping everything as unified as possible, so that it would be easier to drop text across, you know, this entire section or this entire section, and still have it relative to its position on the mesh. So how many versions is that? That's 4 different versions. So that's 1. That's 2. That's 3. I think this is, and this is 4. So let's just do something. I'm going to duplicate all of those, move them to their own layer. Whoops. Not sure the order these are in, so, and that should be it, just 4, right? So there are 4 L's. Join them all together. Edit mode. Oop. Select plus key, control. So that's a handy tool that you can use. If you've got, rather than trying to do a loop select in between meshes, all these meshes are joined together. What you can do is just select an element, an edge, a face, or a vertex, and using Control plus, that's numpad plus key, you can then select that section. So we've got one UV map, zoom out, one UV map, that's another UV map, that's yet another UV map, and that's that UV map. So that's 4 different UV maps of the same object. Yeah, so so that's exactly the problem. I mean, in terms of this is comments in chat. So the person would have to mark or color each section. This is Liana saying section to find out where they line up on the mesh, and that's yes. So that's exactly what you would have to do. Which obviously, oh, hang on, have we got the? Where's the original? We haven't even got the original in here yet. So let's just copy that, move that to the. So this is the original. Join that together. There is a way to turn off the texture. Where is it? Oh no, that smushes the UV map. Can't remember where that setting is. Right, so this is the original that we're comparing it all to. Move all of that into the desktop. Right, so we've got the original, which is, as we say, relatively straightforward to derive from, but depending on what it is, how you want to texture this, it might be slightly more tricky. So yes, you would then have to paint the various sections to see where the to see how the edges align. But in painting, you're also not just the edges, but their orientation relative to one another, because we don't know, for the sake of argument, which way round this should be. Should it be that way around, or should it be that way around? And it's the same with the longer section. We don't know if it's that way around or that way around. But as we say, this is the easiest UV map to derive from. For more complicated ones, depending on what it is that someone's... And of course, there are no overlaps with this. Whereas with all of these, there is. And it's this one section. But these are all slightly... well, you're going to get... depending on what it is that you're wanting to texture or how you want to texture them, you'll get slightly different, or I wouldn't say better results, but you'll certainly get different results, and it might be easier to do certain things with these than it would be with this. So that's one of your... So as a mesher, this is probably your biggest challenge. It's not just making the mesh, but if you're making a mesh that's going to be derivable, that making a UV map, and you can see actually as well one of the other issues, if we look at the size of these relative to each other, this one is the biggest, in the sense of, if we look at the letter L's, or the L bits, L elements, this section, this one has the biggest, which basically means that they're going to be better defined, or as well defined as this original, because it's using more texture space. The texture maps should be on the... Hang on, let me just find them. Oh, there's a lot of Valentine's contests in the... Where's it gone? Has it moved? It was in the hosted contests section of the discussions. It's not... Oh, it's, it looks like it's been moved somewhere. They were available on the product page that ShannonMac uploaded, but for some reason I cannot find them. They were linked to from the discussions, which we all love. IMVU hosted contests. Oh, it looks like it's being spammed with Valentine's contests. Oh, I can't find it. Basically the... Yes, the lovely forums. Discussion, not forums. Is that the... Yes, that's it. So Liana's linked to it in group, in chat rather. It's a product 40 million products in the catalogue. 40 million. 40403283. Yes, so the maps are on. So that's a product page. That's a product page that that's associated with the item as per Shannon uploading it to the catalogue. Yes, so just reading back through the chat relative to these UV map sections. So yes, you would have to, if the deriver would have to mark the UVs to determine where everything is, and then obviously make an assessment as to what they want represented on the object. Yes, it's very hard to get into the head of a creator. Hot Rod, quite true. So essentially, I guess what we could say really is that again, it comes down to, if this is for you, then these would be pretty much okay to use, and this one particularly would give you an optimal amount of texture space to use. It's slightly larger, only just. It's slightly larger than default, but if it's for somebody else, then perhaps just keeping things simple is the best course of action. So even though this isn't particularly optimal in terms of texture space, because there's a huge amount of wasted texture space, whereas these aren't as wasteful, and whatever room is left over you could quite easily use for something else, because you've got a clearly delineated area with all of these, apart from maybe that one perhaps. But you could use these for your own work and work around things like these overlaps without too much issue. But for others, then yes, the most straightforward might be the best solution. But you will find that you may have to play around with the UV maps to see what you come up with to make that determination. Yes, so depending on what I'm just reading through the comments there, the chat. Yeah, so depending on what the sign is used for, whether it's for you or whether it's to be derived from, because this relies, any of these will rely on the deriver knowing how to, or being observant enough to know that there's an issue, an overlap issue there, which isn't easy to solve from a meshes point of view, unless you do this, or you split, as we said before, as discussed before, we split these faces away. Because we can't, even with this one, so you can't do a back-to-back because that face overlaps regardless as to which side it's on. And you want to avoid splitting the bottom away from the letter, because that breaks the continuity of the front and back. These elements, whoops, these bits. So that's but sometimes you have to go through this many iterations of the UV map in order to settle on what might have been your initial unwrap. So it's a lot of playing around, with UVs and keeping other people, what other people would do. Because I wonder if you could just let's see. No, that won't fit in there. So you see, even something as simple as that, just to change the orientation slightly. Good thing about wireframes though is you can realign the UVs to where they appear on the UV map. Way. Yeah, so Leanna's mentioning SketchUp. SketchUp, yes, that's SketchUp. The way that can be used is that it's essentially splitting the UV into what are essentially called planar projections. So what it does, let me see, think of a way to do this. I'm going to duplicate the L again, move that to another layer. See, because that's another way that you could do this, you see. Because what you could do with your UVs is, so let me break this up. Tralala. So this is the Y key. It splits an edge based on a selection. So this is what you could do, or this is the result. This is kind of how it would work in terms of what the UV map does, or what SketchUp is doing, I should say. So we've then got those three and those. Whoops. Actually, no, let's do those two. Move those up. Move these three down. And then that leaves that center one. So this is another way. You don't actually do this to the mesh. You don't actually do what I've just done to the mesh. This is essentially what you could do with the UV maps. And it essentially, and this is kind of how SketchUp works in a very basic. It can do obviously much more complicated UV maps, but if you think about it in terms of what it's doing at a basic level, this is what it does. It splits the mesh essentially into, they're not individual faces, they're planar projections, which basically means that if you think of a slice through a loaf of bread, so this front group of faces is it's on a plane, it's on a flat surface, so it will map a single texture. So this is the UV map for that section. So it will map the entire, let's say the entire height. It'll map the entire height to that section of the mesh, but it's a UV. And it'll do that with each of the individual faces. So this is not the same as a reset, which has the entire texture smushed within the bounds or the boundary or the space of an individual face. So if I just do reset, UV reset. So if we watch, so this is the entire UV selected. So if we watch what it does, so what we have is each triangle or each face mapped one-to-one to the entire image. That's what we don't want. We don't want that. And this differs from planar projection in the sense that it is UV mapping as much as it can to individual faces. So this is more or less a selection-based UV mapping. So if you select a face and just UV map it or unwrap it, you'll start to see what it's doing. So we'll do this side as well. So that's flipped, whereas the other one wasn't. And this is essentially what SketchUp does different. So those are two shapes. As shapes, those are two identical UV maps. But Blender flips one of them, but not the other. And this is essentially what SketchUp is in a... This is obviously a very basic explanation, but this is essentially what SketchUp is doing. So you could do it that way, but again it means that you are breaking up the mesh into a lot of smaller sub-elements, and they're all mapped relative to their own themselves as separate individual units rather than as a part of an overall object. So I wonder if what you could do, an alternative, might be to, let's try, we don't want project from view, don't want Q projection, let's try Smart UV. So that's Smart UV, which isn't particularly useful. I mean, in this instance, it's not anyway. So let me just do a... So this is now version 6. So let's move that to another layer. So let's do a smart projection for that. Yeah, so what that's done, that's essentially, that's what I was looking for. So yes, the hardware, this is the hardware. So that's doing essentially what SketchUp does. So the smart projection is breaking each of these sections up so that they're all planar, or in this instance they're called, it's smart projection, but we've got the front face, the front and back are separate units because they are both planes or flat surfaces. So that's what it's doing. So that's an alternative, but again it's it produces a slightly discombobulated UV map. Whether that would be easier to UV map from, not to derive from, is up for debate. Where is that? That should be down here somewhere. Because we could then increase the size of the UVs, and that gets us that. So that might be slightly easier for derivation. But what we've got are a lot of separate faces, so you end up, it's not the same problem, but it's a replication of the problem that we were having before, in that the deriver doesn't know which part of the mesh corresponds to which UV. So again, that's UV map iteration interpretation number 7. So there's a lot of different ways that the UV maps can be unwrapped relative to what the object is used for. So if it's for you, it's pretty much do what you want. But if it's for derivation, is this easier than this? Yeah, so, you know, it's not always, your first unwrap isn't necessarily always going to be the one that you want to use, but it may end up being the one that's optimal for derivation, because as we've seen, it's not that these maps are necessarily more complicated, but that might be slightly more intimidating. Seeing that might be slightly more intimidating because the UV maps flipped and rotated in all sorts of directions, that even though to a mesher, the mesher understands what's going on here, the deriver, the person deriving as a texture artist, may not. So this bottom one, the first one that we did, may be the easiest after all of that work. So we've just spent about an hour doing these different UV maps. So we've got 4 there and another 2 or 3 elsewhere. So that's 7 different iterations of a UV map for a letter. It's just a letter, a simple shape. It's a very simple shape, but I think that may have been one of the versions that we tried earlier, Frenzy. So if you've so we've probably, no, that's fine. That's fine. Depending on what it is that you specifically mean, yes, we may very well have tried that earlier. These are the versions that we were just, well, that's just some of the versions. So we've got all these different types or positions and unwraps of a simple letter. So that's 4 of, that's the original is down here. And then we have these additional ones up top, but then there are other ones there's this one, that's a smart projection, and then there's this one which is a similar smart projection. Well, it's a smart projection without the letter being all broken up the way that it was, but this is essentially as Liana raised the point about SketchUp, and this is essentially what SketchUp does. for derivers, they have to know which bit is for which. So for you as a mesher, what you would have to probably do, let's assume that this was the final UV map. So we need to save the UV layout, so export. UV7. Switch that to 1. Export. So that's our UV map. We would then need to, where's it gone? Right, so that's our UV. So what we would then need to do, let me just create a background for this, create a background. So what we would then need to do is go through and maybe number these. So that people could tell which section was for which, and also is it vertically? Yeah, so we would have to flip some of them upside down relative to the UV map, and that would make it obvious to the person deriving that this is upside. I mean, not that this letter L being upside down wouldn't make this obvious, but let's say for the sake of argument, so the number 2 needs to be flipped upside down. And that indicates that that surface, that section of the UV, is upside down. So we can do one of two things, again, thinking of the deriver. So we can either produce a texture map that has this with these numbers upside down, or we can flip the sections the right way up, resave the UV map, and then correct or flip these back up the right way. To reflect the change in the UV map. So let me just do a quick well, that was nice and accurate. Whoops, wrong thing. So that should mean that the UV map that you provide will have the letter L the right way up underneath number 7. So that's another way around the issue of letting people know where and which way up your UV maps are. And you might have to do this actually with the other. This might make it easier, or might make So if you decided on using a more complicated UV, doing something like that on your published map might make it easier for people to derive from, because you can then mark out the sections. So to indicate that this strip across the middle is all one strip, your UV map could be coloured or indicated with arrows, with text, whatever it is that you might think useful, could indicate that that's what that is. It's a unified strip. Same with this, same with this, same with all of these bits actually. So that's two aspects that help derivers. I mean, this is the simplest, and then in combination with perhaps marking out the orientation with a bit of text. Still got the original in here. No, where's the original one? So putting some text in place, that would make it obvious the orientation of the UVs. To a hot rod, marking seams. Well, essentially, that's all we've done with all of these, is just mark seams. And we've marked seams in a way that is essentially, because a seam causes a split. It splits the UVs, or it's, if you imagine that, where is it? Where do we put it? Right, so let me just switch back to default. Can you see how? Let me just quickly do this. Right. This will explain what seams do. So as we spin around the object, we can see that each of these surfaces is separate from its neighbours, apart from this front face and the back face. So basically, this is what seams do. So if you were to produce a UV map that corresponds to this mesh, which is that's this one. That's the one where we did the which one was it? Smart UV projection. So what Smart UV projection has done is basically split all the faces relative to them being a single plane or a flat surface. So for most of these, they're individual surfaces or they're individual faces, except for the front. Well, that's the front and back of the letter. Now, the feature itself, Smart UV, it does this by default. But if you imagine that this, what we're looking at, this UV map, if you imagine that the edges around each of these individual elements, each of these around the edges is marked with a seam, it's actually doing this to the mesh. It's exploding it based on whether it can find a flat surface. In these two faces, for instance, they're actually they are on the same plane. So if I switch to, so we can see that they're on the same plane, but because they are not joined together, it produces two separate UV segments, and they're all the way up here. Seams or seam marking do the same thing. So wherever there is an edge that's marked, it causes a split in the UV. So if you were to replicate the Smart UV unwrap, and you were doing it manually, this is what you'd have to do. You'd have to mark each of the edges of the object relative to the UV being split up. And that's what seams are doing. So wherever there's a seam marked, it will split the it will split the mesh. So in UV virtual space, shall we say, this is what we get, which we just adjusted and tidied up. Was that one then? Yes, which was this one. So we tidied this up a little bit, but this originally, so if I just do this again, see if it'll do it again. Yeah, so that UV corresponds to this as an object. And the process itself, whoops, where's it gone? The process itself is doing this in a virtual sense to the mesh to produce the UV map that we were just looking at. So it's splitting the mesh wherever there's an edge that it can determine is a plane or a single unified surface, and it'll map that as a single unified UV map section. So for the smart projection, it's doing that. For the where have we put them? For the other UVs, don't know how easy this is to see. Default. So we've got UVs positioned, not UVs, we've got seams placed at specific strategic points on the mesh. So for instance, the UV that has the upright split in two, so that these two sides are joined as a unit in the UV, and these two sides are joined as a unit in the UV. to do that, we have to split the edge across the diagonal. So it's these two edges. And that physically, well, it doesn't physically split. In relative to the UV, it's splitting the UVs so that we can do that. So that we end up with that pairing and that pairing. Without the split, or if we remove the seam from one of them, what ends up happening is that this whole section unwraps as a flat surface. So it's essentially like a cardboard box. If you slit a cardboard box down one corner and laid it out flat, that's what you get. So that's the UV. And switch to the editor. So those two sections are the two corresponding halves of this upright. But without that seam that's in the diagonal that we've just cleared, these two would essentially be, so they would probably be joined like so. So that there's a continuation of those surfaces across. And that's all UVs are doing. They're creating splits in the mesh so that we can create isolated elements, or we can break the UVs into sections. And that's what produces these different layouts, because we're essentially cutting the box in different places to flatten it out in different ways. So for instance, let's do a simple box. Move to a clean layer. Home. I think we went over this with previously in one of the so that's a cube. Simple cube. So it's got 6 sides. So how do you want this unwrapped? So what we can do, we can unwrap each of the faces as individual UVs. And splitting the mesh up like this is essentially what the UV seams do. Or you could mark seams in a way that, that's gone a bit wonky. Why's that gone wonky? That should be joined together. So you've got two sections. So to do that, you would mark seams on these edges around the mesh. So you're basically creating two clamshells or two letter C's, or so you would a cardboard box, you would be cutting the faces or the sides so that you would end up with these two shapes. Or let's think about this. Just rotate that flat. Rotate that flat. This is all pretty rough and ready, but it'll do for illustrative purposes. rotate that. Whoops. Rotate that, and this is the classic. Whoops. This is essentially the classic way that you would unwrap a box. So that is 180 because we have to flip it upside down. Oop. So that's a classic box unwrap, and for that you'd be marking edges like this. So as a let's put an actual box in here so that we can do a comparison. So cube. So I don't know how easy this is to see on screen. Where's the box gone? Oh, we're inside out. So double-sided. Where's backface culling? Right, so what we want is this bottom UV map. Essentially, let's call this the UV map. So essentially, we want this, and that's our starting point. It's this. So to get this side, isolated, that's this face. So we select those three edges and mark seams. So that splits those edges from the rest of the box, which allows this to lay flat like that. And then for these sides, which correspond to these sides, we need to mark edges on those sides so that we isolate those from the rest of the box. And in doing that, what we get is this middle, this side, and this is the top. So let me just do a quick this might make this slightly easier to see or to should see once these are assigned. Right, so give each of these and then we'll color them. So select. So that's that face. Color this red. Deselect. Select. So that's that face. We'll color that green. So when we select, oh, that's good. Yes, it does do that. So when we select a face, it obviously selects the material that's assigned to it. So what we'll do is just go through this and give each one of these a color. So that's our UV. This would be, or this is a representation of the UV. So looking at the cube, corresponding faces. So we need 6. So that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So we want the red one. Where's the red one gone? So that's the red. Okay, so assign that. So that's the one that's selected is the red one. So this will be the gold one. This one at the bottom. So we need to assign that. So that's the gold one, which is material 2. That's the green one. So that's material... This is the purple one. This is the blue one. So we'll select, assign. That's the blue one. And this one at the top is the pale blue one. So what we've essentially done is unwrap this central strip as the main element of the box or of the mesh, and then marked seams for the purple and the green face so that they just flop out to the side. And we do that by marking seams that will literally do that for the mesh. So it isolates these two faces so that they can flop and pivot around these two bottom edges. And it's the same with the back side, which is the red face. That's isolated by these 3 edges and allowed to flop over as a cardboard box with this edge. And that's how you use your seams to, well, this is the classic box, but depending on the configuration of your edges and how you want the box to unwrap, each one of these corresponds to a section of the UV. So purple or pink for pink, blue for blue, sky blue is this end one, because obviously that means that the sections that we've got just flop out and lay out and extend, because there's nothing joining these together, because they're isolated from the rest of the mesh with these edges. So it can be, it's the marking seams isn't so much the issue as it is trying to figure out which edge to mark in order to unwrap or flatten a mesh. So yes, there are, depending on, just reading through the comments again, so depending on what it is that you're trying to do, your UV seams control where splits occur in the UV map so that the object unwraps relative to something that makes sense. Because obviously if you don't unwrap, if you don't mark your seams cleanly, what you end up with is a bit of a smushed mesh. I can't do it in this particular example, but let's say for the sake of argument that these two edges were not marked So those two edges correspond to this edge. And if there were no seam there, what we would end up with is something akin to this. So let me just, I want average, medium point. So that's what your UV map would look like. If you did not mark a seam on this selected edge that's at the front that we're looking at, your UV map would unwrap like that. And it gets really messy. Let's say, for the sake of argument, you didn't mark this edge running along the top either. So if that were, if there were no seam marked there, you would end up with something that looked like this. And obviously elsewhere around the mesh, depending on how you've got your seams marked. So of course that's squashed and distorted three faces based on essentially this corner being joined. Is it that corner or no? So it's this corner at the bottom. So these two edges not being marked with seams ends up like this with quite a distorted UV map. So if you were trying to put text on this, so if this was a, let's say for the sake of argument, this was a toy block and you had a letter on there, it would be all distorted because the UVs aren't cleanly laid out. So that's what your seams do. What is that for, Liana? Nail screws. Yes, so that's, yeah. So doing, I mean, obviously for simple shapes, UV maps are relatively simple and straightforward because you can create relatively clean edges. But for more complex shapes, as we were just doing with the letter L, it starts to get tricky. But in essence, that's all seams are doing. They are marked so that the map can lay out flat. So what you're essentially trying to do is split the mesh so that you can isolate, as we've got colors assigned to these, so you're isolating the colors that are associated with the faces of the cube. And it takes a bit of trial and error, as we saw with the letter L, all the different versions that we did. Oh, and slightly related to what Liana's saying with regards to DAS. The process of unwrapping can be made slightly more complicated or fiddly if your mesh is subdivided. So whether you do, in Blender in particular, it's just subdivide, or whether you're using the subdivision mesh, where is it? because that then increases the density of the mesh and the number of surfaces that you're having to play with in order to create your UV map. So this is one of the reasons why you want to try and optimize your meshes as much as possible and make them as low poly as possible. You use as many faces as are needed to describe the shape that you are trying to describe. I think we mentioned this when we discussed this when we were going over the making of the love heart, that this was pretty dense as a mesh, but we reduced it quite significantly without affecting too detrimentally the shape of the letter or the shape of the character, and it's barely noticeable. But this would present you with other issues depending on the density. So if there were a lot of faces, your UV map is going to be correspondingly simplified or complicated depending on that. So that's another thing that you have to think about. And so select, let me just do. Yeah, so for something like this, what you could do is just put a seam in that indentation and at the bottom and split these into halves. But again, it depends on how you were wanting this to be derived, because doing it this way, the deriver could at least type some text across the entire length of that and it would wrap around without issue. But if you're wanting to do something where the text wrapped around the object, that presents problems, obviously, because it's difficult to determine which way, which face belongs to which section of the front and back. Selecting all that. So it's another question of because this wastes a lot of space doing it this way, but that may be not the only option, but the most effective for making the object easy to derive from. Well, we're coming up on 2 hours again, so any questions relating to what we've just been doing, other than trying it out and seeing? It's just a question of playing around with the objects that you are working with, and it can be frustrating, but it's just keep marking edges until you get something that you're happy with. Yes, it's not as bad to texture, but again, it's always the same. It's always the same concerns in terms of how. So for the heart, you might be able to do something as simple as with the texture. Let's see for example, you would get away with just painting an outline. Let's just change the color of that just to make it easier. So you'd get away with painting an outline around the object and doing the same top and bottom of the strip, and you would get a nice continuation over the two parts of the UV map, because they are, because you're doing something simple to the texture. But if you're wanting to, so we'd have to assume then that that is going to be the middle. So you'd then have to start thinking about how you relate this painting in this area. Does that relate to this side, or does it relate to this side? So if you start laying text out, have to make sure that just duplicate that. So on this side, it might need to be flipped upside down. So that it reads correctly when you are turning around the mesh. So again, it might be worth, when you're putting your texture assets together for derivation, the derivation, to help derivers, texturers, by placing some text. It doesn't matter what the text is, just placing some text so that they can immediately see the orientation of the faces, or the orientation of the UV, that section of the UV relative to other elements, as we did with this one. Yes, thanks. Liana's linking to the contest mesh in chat. Yes, there may be something to do. It may be doing something like that. But that's it's untested. Liana's asking about doing something where we show hide a mesh that's part of a pose, which you can do with 3D Studio Max without too many issues, but that's untested with Blender and FBX. So that'd have to be tested first to make sure that it will do something like that. Well, on that show hide, yes, so like show hide, like polystyrene's chair, like Polly's chair, where you can when you sit down. Is it sit down, or you trigger a type of word to trigger it? I can't remember off the top of my head. But when you do see, when the avatar does an action, performs an action, a mesh will appear, and it's part of, I guess it can be either part of a pose, or it can be part of a furniture item, but it's untested. It's all untested. So yes, that may be for a future stream. All right. Well, we are on 2 hours now, so we shall call it quits there. I'm not sure when there are a couple of other scheduled dates for the Valentine's thing, but I think those were scheduled as sort of emergency, we haven't got it finished yet dates. So I'm not sure what's happening officially next week or the week after. When is the 14th? Next week? Well, however many sessions have been earmarked. I'm not sure what's going on there yet, but maybe doing something over the weekend as per usual. Not related to the Valentine's contest. So yes, the usual, if you like what you see, blah de blah de blah, sub, follow, press the buttons, click things and see what happens. And we shall see you on the next stream. Bye for now. Yes, bye for now. Oh nuts, I forgot to record this again. Debs, you were supposed to remind me. And you forgot. So if you forget, how can I remember?